You're listening to the Leading Healthy Creative Teams podcast with Matt Curtis. This is the podcast that helps you take your creative team from wherever you are today to healthy and effective.
Hey friends, thank you for joining me this week on the Leading Healthy Creative Teams podcast. My name is Matt Curtis and I'm your host. This week I want to talk about what I'm seeing in terms of barriers that churches are putting up between the message of the gospel and those who need to hear it. To start, I want to talk about what some of those barriers are, and then at the end I'm going to give you some recommendations in terms of ways that you can identify that, but also a different model that you can approach, and really a different philosophy that I believe the church needs to be operating out of if it hopes to model the free gift of salvation that Christ has given to us. The first problem that I'm seeing as a barrier isn't one that's exclusive to a single church. It's really more indicative of the new complexity that exists for us as Christians as we try to represent Christ well in our culture. It's that a lot of people have megaphones that are not behaving well as Christians. Obviously, we've seen a lot of this in the political space, but I don't want to limit it to that. This problem isn't just that there are Christians that are on the opposite side of the aisle of you politically. I would argue it's much less that as the sole problem, and it's the angst with which we communicate. We're not representing Christian values in the way that we go about communicating the message of anything, let alone the message of the gospel. Back in 2012, I wrote a book called #Wisdom. It's still on Amazon if you want to check it out. It's like $7, I think. The premise was, what if Solomon was writing Proverbs in the era of social media? And so I spent a lot of time working through Proverbs and identifying some of these principles and truths that I was seeing in my own life at the time, but also that I was seeing as just human condition problems with regards to how we communicate, how we think, how we are prone to elevate idols in our life and chase the wrong thing. We always have the opportunity to worship something. What is it that we have elevated to worship? In the book, I'm talking a lot about these basic principles. The issue that I'm seeing today, though, is the ramifications of us not living lives wisely on social media. It is now much harder for Christians to have meaningful conversations with those who are not Christians because of the huge volume of negative press that we have. Not from the press. I mean, I know so-and-so, they're a jerk. They're super rude. They don't care about other people. They're really judgmental. Those are all challenges for me now, even though I'm not the person that they're talking about. So I can have a great relationships with somebody. But it's the baggage that other people have hitched onto this idea of being a Christian that makes it harder. And so for churches, it's a real uphill battle because the church is the formal institution representing Christianity. And so now all of these Christ followers that are scattered around everywhere, they're contributing to a bad reputation. And so I want to encourage you to think through that lens. What is it that I'm doing individually? I think a lot of times these episodes are very much about the church and about communications proper and about, policies or strategy or thinking around the communication of the church. This first portion, though, don't throw this into the church category. This is for you as an individual. If you are a Christian, if you are a follower of Jesus, it is your responsibility to act like it. It's your responsibility to represent the gospel message to the world around you. Here's really where I want to land this conversation. What is it that we're behaving as? Not just what are we saying we believe or saying we value, but what are we behaving as? What we say doesn't really matter if it's disconnected from what we do. The classic example that I would always share is one week, the pastor or whoever's giving an announcement would hop on stage. We're going to do a financial class this week. We want to help you get out of debt because we know that we shouldn't be in debt as Christ followers. And then the next week, hey, so our building campaign came up short. So we're going to take on $3 million in debt to buy this new property or to build this new expansion. It's like, wait, hold on a second now. That's the idea behind that phrase, communicate on purpose. It's still a value of mine. I care deeply about it. And the reason is because the way we say what we say is actually saying more than the words that we say. So if we're rude and dismissive all the time, that's going to say something about all of the things that we believe. If you find out somebody that's really kind is also a Christian, you say, man, Christians are really kind. If you find somebody who's really abrasive and rude and disrespectful, and then you find out they're Christian, you think, man, if that's what Christianity's about, I don't want to be about that. There's always going to be a connection between those two ideas. So here's the issue that I'm seeing in the context of the church. I call it the do first before we give model. And that's not the term I've heard used for it, but that's what I'm seeing practiced. Here's what it looks like. Little things. Do your events cost money? Does every event cost money? Is there a pathway for me to grow spiritually in the church without spending money? I know it sounds like a little thing. I know the workbooks cost money. I get it. It costs money to print things. Like, if anybody knows, it's me, because I've sent hundreds of those to print over the years. But is there a pathway for somebody to grow in their faith without spending money? Is there a way that you can build compensating those things into the budget? If we have tithe money coming in, we're spending it on something. I recognize that we can charge, but do we have to be charging? Does everything have to cost money with regards to my growth as a Christ follower? The other thing that I see a lot, are you willing to invest in families only if they're attending? I can't tell you the number of times that I hear people say, oh, we care about marriage a lot. Okay, great. What are you doing about it? I mean, we have a marriage class every year in the summer. So we do that. Okay, is that you really helping marriages? I mean, I don't feel like that is, but it's maybe helpful if my marital problems happen to align with your schedule of this doesn't happen very often. How about families? Do I get support as a parent? Like, are you doing anything to help coach me or encourage me as a parent, even if I'm not a part of your church? What if I'm in the local community and I'm having issues with my family? There are activities that we can be doing and actions that we can be acting out that show that we actually care about something, rather than just pontificating on a stage and then not following up. And then the other thing here, are we preaching the gospel outside the walls of our church? I have found that partnership with local organizations is the model of caring for a community in the church. I love that that's a part of what we're doing. My contention, though, is that they're not preaching the gospel. And so what I'm seeing is not that we don't have a good reputation in our community per se. I'm seeing that a good reputation in our community isn't causing people to come in the doors of our church. And more importantly, I'm seeing that a good reputation isn't the same thing as them hearing the gospel. So if they're not coming into the walls of our church, they're literally never going to hear the gospel from us as the church. It doesn't make any sense to me. You're telling me that I have to show up in your box in order to hear the message of the gospel? I don't like that at all. And that's a problem for our culture, who is, by and large, not terribly interested about walking into your box. That's not what is happening right now. And this, to me, is indicative of that post-COVID philosophy or model of operation. We have become very comfortable in our spaces, very comfortable. And we got some nice spaces. The problem is a lot of people don't want to go into your building. And I don't care as much about your attendance. I don't care about your tithing numbers. I don't care about any of that stuff. And I think that's our issue. That's where we're getting hung up. We need to be caring about the lost not hearing the gospel. That's the problem. This is my encouragement and maybe even my challenge. Let's shift our mindset to something that's a little bit more reflective of the way that Jesus actually interacted with those outside of the kingdom. I want to present to you what I think is the dilemma. I call it the go to them versus come to us dilemma. The challenge here is that we're expecting everyone who needs Christ to come to us, and then we can introduce them to Christ. I was working on staff at a church, and I remember the primary push was to bring people to church. And I remember sitting there really struggling with this concept. I was talking to my wife about it, and I brought this concern up to her. When I die, I don't think that I'm going to stand and say, I did a pretty good job. I invited a bunch of people to church so that somebody else could tell them about Jesus. I haven't found that as the measure of a faithful life in Scripture. We want everybody not to be equipped to make disciples, not to be equipped to share the gospel, but we just want them to come to church. That's what we want. We're really saying everyone needs to come to us. And if they don't, I just don't know how they're going to hear the gospel. But I'm going to challenge that notion. I hope that sounds wrong to you already, but I'm going to challenge it with these passages from Scripture. The first one I want to highlight here is Mark 5, verses 1 and 2. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. So what happened to start this story? They went somewhere else. They didn't sit and wait. They didn't hang out in a region and say, okay, everybody who's in need is going to come to me. Now, There are plenty of examples of Jesus going to a place, which is sort of the primary point here, and then other people coming. Absolutely. So I'm not going to argue that there is no value in a local gathering. Absolutely there is. It's critically important. However, there is also a step and an expression of what the church is supposed to be in going out too. So that's all I'm trying to get at here is don't just sit and wait, but you got to go. That's all you hear about in the podcast. That's it. That's the whole point. Stop waiting for non-Christians to come to your church. Go out to non-Christians. All right, back to the next example. The woman at the well in John chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. So he left Judea, speaking of Jesus, and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. Again, he had to go to a place. So they went through Samaria. If you've been in church at all, you know that going through Samaria was an abnormal move. Then the story continues that Jesus was sitting at the well. A woman comes up and she's going to pull some water and he asks her for a drink. And it begins this whole dialogue. It's a really powerful example of Jesus interacting with those who are far away from the values of what God has to say. He initiated the conversation and it's a beautiful story. But the starting point here is that Jesus went somewhere. He didn't just sit around in Jerusalem waiting for the woman at the well to come to him. He proactively went to the lost. And then the final example that, I think sometimes we look at these stories and we say, oh, these people, I'm not a demon-possessed man. That's so foreign to me. I don't have 5 husbands. That's so foreign to me. The message of the gospel is the same. Jesus was sent to us. There's a song that I love, and it says, while we were still enemies. We were enemies, and now we're seated at his table. Such a beautiful expression and articulation of this transition. I'm going to read for you John 3:16. You may have heard it before, but I'm also going to read 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. There's this beautiful word of send. This wasn't, he was called, he was summoned. The lost of the world said, hey, Jesus, come on by. That's not what happened. He was sent. And this is the problem. I think we're now all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're into this, we're reading all these passages. How does this belong in a communications podcast? Because what we're doing in the way that we communicate and the way that we minister is we're putting restrictions on the message of the gospel. We're putting hurdles. We're putting hoops that people have to jump through. We're saying you don't get to hear the message of the gospel unless you come to us. We're saying you don't get your family to be healthier or better or living by wise principles unless you come to us. We're saying I'm not willing to give you a free resource like a podcast or a video channel on YouTube that has good principles for good living until you come to our church. We're going to put it behind a password protected page. We're only going to send it out to our membership. We're putting all of these restrictions. And the reason this matters is because our culture is gathering places today. I know where they're gathering. They're gathering on YouTube. They're gathering on Instagram. They're gathering on Facebook. You remember the stats from the beginning of the last episode. They're gathering in the digital space. And the reason content creation matters so much for the church is because we have the opportunity to present the gospel to people outside of our walls. I'm not saying go knocking door to door and present the gospel to people. You can if you want to. If you're a gifted evangelist, if that's a model of ministry that you want to adopt, try it and see if it works. But I'm telling you, I know where they're gathering. I know where to have these conversations. It's by communicating to people where they're gathering, which is on all these different social network platforms. The church is remarkably quiet in these spaces. And I don't think that that's a good thing because the church is the one who's advocating for the message of the gospel, preaching the message of the gospel. That's who's doing it. And the individuals that are rising up and taking on this challenge individually, personally, and proclaiming the gospel in these platforms, props to them. Keep it up. My contention, though, is that if we can build a group of people, if we can build an audience in these platforms and then have a place for them to belong to gather in the local church, Man, that's beautiful. And that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be when people come to know Christ, they get embedded into a local body of believers. That's what's supposed to happen. My encouragement to you, and maybe my challenge to you, is begin looking for opportunities to proclaim the gospel outside the walls of your church. Maybe it looks like it's somebody on your team. Maybe it looks like it's a department who's invested in digital evangelism. Maybe it looks like partnering with volunteers that are on your team or people that are in your congregation already who are good at this stuff. They're savvy at it. They know how to do it. Talk to them and bring them into this mission of the church. Proclaim the gospel to a lost world in a digital space. That's it. That's all we're talking about. Now, you may be sitting here thinking to yourself, how do I even assess these things? What am I supposed to do with this information? I'm going to encourage you to do 3 things. Start here. First, make a list of the 0 prerequisite opportunities that your church offers in terms of growing spiritually. So let's say somebody comes to your church who is not a Christian. Is there an opportunity for them to grow that's no restrictions, no reservations at all? Is there a mechanism for somebody who doesn't know Jesus to begin to learn about who he is in your church? What does that look like? Do you have anything like that? List it out. Then make a list of all of your outsider-friendly events. If you do like a trunk or treat or you have a Christmas tree lighting, what are the things that are events that are open to those who are outside the church? And then make a list of what are the events that are proactively gospel declaration events. That's a very uncommon way to say that. But what are the events that really are designed to preach the gospel to those who do not know the gospel? What does that look like? These can be long-term relationships. These can be long-term partnerships. But I think there's a responsibility for the church to be actually doing something in these relationships too. It's not just cutting a check to another group of people that are like pretty good at doing this stuff. I'm saying, how is it that you as the Christ follower, your church, the people that are assembling there, the congregation, how are they being sent out? Think of that principle. We're not just sitting there and waiting for people to come to us. We're not waiting for that non-Christian to show up at our house. We're going out and we're being intentional about building relationships in our communities with those who don't yet know Jesus. If your church is presenting the gospel, but it's behind some sort of a paywall, whether that be financial, whether that be you have to attend, it is not in alignment with what the actual gospel is. The gospel isn't about withholding as much as possible. The gospel is the opposite. It is absurdly gracious. It is unfathomably give first. That's what the gospel is. I believe that the church needs to be showing the same extravagant grace that was shown to us when Christ died for us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Leading Healthy Creative Teams. This podcast is just one of the ways Lunchtime Heroes helps build healthy creative teams in the church. Stay up to date on the latest by signing up for the Creative Bites email at lunchtimeheroes.co.